Okay, Danielle, your son's school is denying your request for an evaluation for one-to-one aid. Is this legal? Now, I've said this in some other videos in the past. I'll say it again here. And I understand what you're saying, but I like to say it, so just bear with me. Is it legal? Yeah, of course it's legal. Is it right? Is it appropriate? Is it correct? No. I mean, in that realm, yes, I understand what you're saying. But what I really want parents and educators as well to grasp from the words that we use, okay? Because we're entering a realm in the United States right now to where words don't have meaning, okay? And it's wrong. It absolutely is wrong. We should not be allowing it. We should not be permitting it. We should not be ignoring it, forgiving it, excusing it, anything like that. Okay? Words are incredibly important, and what those words mean are incredibly important. So the entire legal structure of this country, the entire constitutional system that we're under, rely wholly and completely upon our proper usage and understanding and definition of words. So if we're just callously throwing them around or excusing how they're being used by other people, then that's on us. So that's the reason I take a little bit more time in differentiating between what's legal, all right, and then what's appropriate per regulations or per policy. IDEA is an act created by Congress that comes with funding, okay? Funded also largely by state. It's a civil rights act, and schools need to follow it. Now, is it illegal for them not to? No, it's not illegal. Legal has a completely different definition. It's just in the realm that we live in with regards to special education, it's appropriate, inappropriate, a violation, not a violation, procedural violation, substantive violation. Those are all terms that we use in that realm and not legal. All right, because, what does that mean anyway? It just is not an appropriate usage for special education. So, with that being said, 3 minutes into the video, can they deny you? They shouldn't deny you. They can deny you. They're the school. They can deny you. Now, what do you do when they can deny you? Well, you can trigger one of the many areas to call into question their refusal to do a proper analysis of whether your child requires the proper amount of supports in the form of, let's say, a designated aide. That would be, let's say you live in a state that offers facilitated IEP meetings. They'd be offered free of charge by the state, somebody coming in with the training to facilitate that disagreement to try to get consensus on your team. The mediation process, that's available to you. Filing a state complaint where people from your State Department of Education would do an investigation on their refusal to do an analysis on whether your child requires a one-to-one aid. And then lastly is the due process complaint, where they would assign a hearing officer. You'd put on evidence, things of that nature. Now, what you need to be mindful of is where you are in that process, to the point where, do you have enough that has occurred thus far to justify the request for the one-to-one aid? Because that's where this disagreement is lying right now. The school, I don't know this for sure, I'm making a huge assumption or presumption based upon, I guess, my historical understanding of where these disagreements derive. But typically the school will sit there and say, well, we don't see the things that you're seeing, or we don't believe that, per our rubric that, your child requires one. And so they would be basing it upon their data to that point to decide whether or not they need to put that into consideration. Now, they shouldn't be doing that. You are a valuable member of the IEP team. You're 50% of that decision-making process. So they should do an analysis, or at least explain it well enough to you to understand what would need to be considered per the district's understanding. And, you know, some schools will use this rubric. Now, I've asked for copies of their rubric, and some of these schools just refuse to hand it over because it's BS. There is no rubric other than one that they may create. I will tell you this, though. You know, many, and I'll say this in infinite, many schools just don't like handing out one-to-one aides, designated aides. The reason that they don't is because of funding. They're not supposed to tell you that. They're not supposed to make that as a reason or an excuse. But then at the same time, there's some very legitimate concerns that you need to take into account as an IEP team member of learned helplessness. Okay, that will be a reason why a school system will say, well, you know, we don't believe that that's appropriate for him. The long-term goal for your child, okay, which is independent living, economic viability, and continuing education, which to accomplish those things in the real world, your child will not be receiving an aide, you know, when they end up graduating from high school or aging out of the special education process. So the goal is always to maximize and get your child to a point of independence, maximizing their independence. We absolutely are cognizant that there are children, and when I say we meaning all of us, parents and educators alike, and special education attorneys and board attorneys, that we want to encourage and foster independence to the maximum extent appropriate for them. There are a lot of children that require one-to-one designated support. But the goal, when you have a child that needs that, the goal is to always bring them to a point where they don't need it. And that is going to be data-driven, data collection-driven. So if you're going into it knowing what the obstacles are or what the responses are from the school district, then at that point you know sort of how to frame your argument to get around those obstacles. So instead of one-to-one designated support, change the word you use to be designated support at important points of the day where your child requires support. And then notating areas where the team wants to foster and encourage your child's independence. All right? Because it's the one-to-one designated support from the time your child gets there to the end of the day that tends to be the sticking point with school districts and IEP teams. Eliminate that by targeting that support. Now, that can be the majority of the day. But at other points, it may not be. It could be just in instructional periods. And if it's not in instructional periods, then it's in non-academic settings like in hallways or bathrooms or PE, you know, because your child's a runner. You focus on what those areas are where your child really needs the support, and then you frame your argument to the IEP team that you're not necessarily asking that they strap your child to the back of an aide inside of a baby Bjorn, you know, to where they just wear them around all day. All right, because that's the visual image for many of the people on the IEP team on the school side. So you need to dispel that. And that's where understanding how that different verbiage is interpreted as opposed to a parent and a school system, vastly different sometimes. And then when you really deconstruct it for the parent, they're not necessarily asking for a one-to-one aide all day strapped to a baby Bjorn. What they're wanting is targeted support, and they're wanting to foster the independence for their child. So that's where you frame it, and you have a much deeper conversation with your school system and what you're looking for. But if they're denying your request, then ask them why they're denying a request. Maybe you have that information now. And if that requires, let's say, a functional behavior assessment, then they need to do one. And if they've already done one and they've already made the decision, then you trigger an independent functional behavior analysis. Or And look, this can be expanded out. Let's say you're saying, well, it's not about behavior, James. It's about, well, it's going to be about behavior. Because even things like redirection, staying on task, I mean, those are all behaviors. Running is a behavior. So I think it's all behavior based. Anything requiring a designated aide outside of, let's say, health needs. So if that's the case, then the route would be through a functional behavior analysis. And what you would also need to have whoever's doing the analysis, as far as taking the data to be reviewed by the team, is what are the child's rates of engagement, meaning staff engagement with your child. That they can ticker tape, they can sit there and check mark every time your child's engaged, because that's typically not looked at all or considered. So you have a lot of children, let's say, that don't have maladaptive behaviors. They're not tearing up the classroom. They're not screaming. In fact, they're very happy being left alone in their own world. But if they're not being engaged, then are they learning? And so there's a lot of things with regards to the subtlety of behavior in that area that teachers miss because they have a classroom of 20 kids. So you can't expect them to see a child that's well behaved over there. There's an assumption that the child's paying attention. We as parents of these children know that they're not, and they're losing a lot of information. So that's where observing the rates of interaction with the adults, the rates of engagement for your child, the rates of manding your child, requesting, or your child engaging back independently. That would also give you an insight on the need for redirection and the time span, let's say in a 30-minute period, where your child is engaging. You can break that stuff down to the nth degree and get a very, very good picture on the kind of staff support your child requires. But I completely agree with you. That's done through data collection. That's done through observation. And so they need to do that analysis. They can't deny you that. They just should not. They can deny it to you, but it puts the district an unnecessary litigious situation by denying something like that. They need to be able to verify and validate why they don't think that your child requires it. And that's through data collection. It's not through somebody's, well, I don't think so. I mean, I don't think so doesn't cut it. We need something more tangible. A lot of information in there, and provide more detail, and we can sit there and whittle and walk through this and see where we can go with it. Okay?